She handed me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner. What she didn't know was that her lawyer would be begging me for a job within 6 months. My name is Marcus Chun, 38 years old, and until that Wednesday evening at Romano's Italian restaurant, I thought I had a marriage worth celebrating. 10 years. A decade of building a life together, of shared dreams and quiet Sunday mornings. Sarah had insisted we go to Romano's, the same place where we'd had our first date. "It's romantic," she'd said, but there was something in her voice that should have warned me. I'd arrived first, secured our usual table by the window, ordered the Chianti we always shared. Sarah walked in at exactly 7:30, wearing the black dress I'd bought her for her promotion last year. She looked beautiful. She also looked nervous. "Marcus," she said, sitting down without the usual kiss on the cheek. "We need to talk." I nodded, thinking maybe she wanted to discuss vacation plans or the kitchen renovation we'd been debating. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Legal size, official looking. "I've filed for divorce," she said simply. "I've already retained Jonathan Berkowitz from Sterling and Associates. These are the preliminary papers." I stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. Around us, couples laughed over wine and pasta. Our waiter hovered uncertainly in the distance, probably sensing the tension. "I understand," I said finally, because what else do you say when your world implodes over breadsticks? Sarah blinked, clearly expecting more of a reaction. Tears, maybe. Anger, definitely. But I'm not that kind of person. Never have been. "That's it?" she asked. "That's all you're going to say?" I took a sip of wine, buying time to process. "What would you like me to say, Sarah? You've obviously put a lot of thought into this decision. You've hired an attorney. You prepared paperwork. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment thing." Her face flushed slightly. "I've been unhappy for a long time, Marcus. We've grown apart. We want different things." I nodded again. Different things like what? But I already knew. Sarah had been changing over the past 2 years, ever since her promotion to marketing director at Lux Brands. New friends, new ambitions, new dissatisfaction with our comfortable but unspectacular life. "You're content to just exist," she said, the words clearly rehearsed. "I want more. I want to travel, to experience life, to be with someone who shares my vision for the future. Someone more ambitious," she meant. Someone who drove a BMW instead of a Honda Civic. Someone who talked about wine varietals and weekend trips to Napa instead of compound interest rates and retirement planning. "I see," I said. "And Jonathan Berkowitz is going to help you get more?" She straightened in her chair. "Jonathan is one of the best divorce attorneys in the state. He handles high net worth cases exclusively." High net worth. That was interesting. Sarah made good money, around $85,000 a year, but we were hardly what you'd call high net worth, unless she was counting assets I didn't know about. "Well," I said, signing a receipt for our untouched wine, "I suppose we should handle this professionally. I'll need to review these papers and retain my own counsel." Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "You're not going to fight this?" I stood up, straightening my tie. "Fight what, Sarah? Your happiness? If this is what you want, then we'll handle it like adults." As I walked to my car, I could feel Sarah watching me through the restaurant window. 10 years of marriage. And she still didn't understand the first thing about me. She saw a quiet, methodical financial analyst who accepted life as it came. What she didn't see was someone who spent his days hunting through complex corporate structures, finding discrepancies others missed, uncovering financial irregularities that could make or break multi-million-dollar deals. She thought she was divorcing a boring accountant. She had no idea she was challenging someone who made a living exposing other people's secrets. I'd met Sarah in 2013 at a friend's housewarming party. She was finishing her MBA, working part-time at a boutique marketing firm, full of dreams about building brands and changing consumer behavior. I was 3 years into my career at Meridian Capital, already developing a reputation for thorough due diligence work. We were opposites in many ways. She was spontaneous where I was planned, social where I was reserved, optimistic where I was realistic. But it worked. For a while. Our first few years were good. Great, even. We bought the house in Westfield in 2015, a modest 3-bedroom colonial that Sarah initially loved. Perfect for starting a family, she'd said, though kids never quite materialized. Too busy with careers, we told ourselves. Too much else to focus on first. I threw myself into work, rising through the ranks at Meridian Capital. My specialty became forensic financial analysis for mergers and acquisitions. When companies wanted to buy other companies, I was a guy who made sure there weren't any nasty surprises hidden in the books. Sarah's career flourished too. The boutique firm was acquired by Lux Brands in 2018, and Sarah moved with the acquisition. Suddenly, she was working with luxury fashion brands, international clients, people who measure success in very different terms than I did. Do you know how much the Hendersons spent on their kitchen renovation? She started asking. Melissa got promoted to VP at 34. Her husband bought her a Mercedes to celebrate. These conversations became more frequent, more pointed. The warning signs were subtle at first. Sarah working later, going out more with the girls from work. New clothes that seemed expensive for our budget. A sudden interest in our financial statements. We should think about diversifying our investments, she'd say. Maybe look into some growth opportunities. I'd agree to review our portfolio, but somehow those conversations never happened. She'd change the subject or say she was too busy to discuss it properly. Then came the questions about prenups and asset division, supposedly triggered by a co-worker's messy divorce. Thank God we don't have complicated finances, she'd said one night, scrolling through her phone. Can you imagine trying to untangle years of investments in business holdings? I'd mumbled agreement, but something nagged at me. Our finances weren't complicated because I'd kept them simple. But Sarah seemed to be fishing for information about assets she should already know about. 3 months ago, I'd noticed charges on our joint credit card that I couldn't place. Not huge amounts, but regular payments to something called lifestyle consulting services. When I asked Sarah about it, she said it was a business expense that had been accidentally charged to the wrong card. I'll get it reimbursed, she'd said. But the charges continued. Small amounts. Easy to miss unless you were someone who reviewed financial statements for a living. I'd also noticed Sarah had become secretive about her phone. New passwords, turned screen down on tables, taken into other rooms for calls that seemed to be with people I'd never heard her mention before. Just work stuff, she explained when I asked who was calling so late. Client crisis in Los Angeles. You know how it is. But I'd worked with plenty of people who had West Coast clients. 9 p.m. phone calls weren't that common, and they certainly didn't require the kind of hushed, urgent conversations I'd overheard. The night of our anniversary dinner, I sat in my study looking at the divorce papers Sarah had given me. The letterhead was impressive. Sterling & Associates, LLP. Offices in Manhattan, Boston, and Hartford. Jonathan Berkowitz's name appeared in bold under Senior Partner, Family Law Division. I pulled up their website. The firm's client list read, like a who's who of high net worth individuals. Professional athletes, entertainment figures, corporate executives. Their fees started at $750 an hour for junior associates. I leaned back in my chair, analyzing this like I would any other financial puzzle. Sarah made $85,000 a year. I made $95,000. Our combined income was solid upper middle class, but hardly enough to justify a $750 an hour attorney. Unless Sarah had assets I didn't know about, or unless someone else was paying the bills. I opened my laptop and began doing what I did best, following the money trail. Our joint checking account showed regular deposits from both our employers. Nothing unusual there. But I noticed that Sarah's direct deposits had been slightly irregular over the past 6 months. Some weeks the amount was higher than her usual salary, some weeks lower. I'd assumed it was commission or bonus structures, but the pattern was odd. Too random to be structured bonuses, too consistent to be truly irregular. I pulled up our investment accounts. Sarah had always left the financial planning to me, claiming she didn't have the head for numbers. Our retirement accounts were solid, growing steadily through conservative investments and company matches. But I noticed something I had missed before. Sarah's 401k contributions had decreased significantly in the past year. from maximum contributions to barely meeting the company match. That was unusual for someone who'd gotten a promotion and presumably a raise. Next, I checked our joint savings account. The balance was lower than I'd expected. Not dramatically so, but enough to notice. Regular transfers out over the past several months, always in round numbers. $500, $1,000, $750. When I'd asked Sarah about them, she'd mention home improvements or mention saving for vacation in a separate account. But I couldn't find evidence of that separate account anywhere. I was about to close the laptop when curiosity got the better of me. I pulled up Sarah's email account. We'd always shared passwords, a remnant from our more trusting early marriage days. Sarah probably assumed I'd never use hers, and she was right until now. Her inbox was mostly work-related, marketing campaigns, and client communications. But buried in a folder labeled Personal Projects, I found something interesting. Email exchanges with someone named Jennifer Walsh, identified as a wealth management consultant. The emails dated back 4 months and discussed asset protection strategies during life transitions and pre-divorce financial planning. Jennifer's signature indicated she worked with high-net-worth individuals navigating complex personal situations. The most recent email, sent just 2 days ago, simply said, "Everything is in place for Wednesday." JB confirmed he has the preliminary documentation. JB Jonathan Berkowitz. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but I needed more information. I closed Sarah's email and shut the laptop. Tomorrow I'd start my real investigation, using the skills that had made me one of Meridian Capital's most thorough analysts. If Sarah thought she could outmaneuver me financially, she was about to discover just how wrong she was. She might be upgrading her lifestyle and her ambitions, but she was still the same person who'd once asked me to explain the difference between a stock and a bond. And I was still the person who could track financial irregularities through layers of corporate obfuscation. What Sarah didn't understand was that forensic financial analysis wasn't just my job. It was my calling. I'd spent years developing an instinct for patterns others missed, for the subtle signs that numbers had been manipulated or moved to hide their true purpose. And now, for the first time in 10 years of marriage, I was going to turn that expertise on my own life. Sarah had made the first move, but she'd underestimated her opponent completely. This wasn't going to be the simple divorce she'd planned with her high-powered attorney. This was going to be a masterclass in why you should never pick a fight with someone who knows exactly where all the bodies are buried, especially when those bodies are buried in financial statements. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I needed uninterrupted time to conduct what I privately called my personal audit. Sarah had already left for the office by the time I got up, her coffee cup still warm on the kitchen counter. She'd left a note. "Marcus, I'm staying at Melissa's for a few days to give us both space. We can discuss logistics this weekend. S. No love, no hugs and kisses, just a business-like transition plan." Even her goodbye was efficiently corporate. I started with what I knew best, following the digital paper trail. Our home office had always been my domain, but I began to see it with new eyes. Sarah rarely used a computer here, preferring her laptop, but occasionally she printed documents or used a scanner. I checked the printer history and found something interesting. Multiple scans of financial documents over the past 3 months. Bank statements, investment summaries, even our tax returns from the previous year. Why would Sarah need scanned copies of documents she already had access to? I pulled our joint tax returns from the filing cabinet. As I reviewed them, I noticed something I had missed during the rush preparation last April. Sarah had claimed a business expense deduction for consulting fees that I didn't remember discussing. $3,200 paid to Walsh Financial Strategies. Jennifer Walsh, the wealth management consultant from Sarah's emails. Sarah had been paying for pre-divorce financial advice and writing it off on our joint tax return. But that raised another question. Where did Sarah get $3,200 for consulting fees? Her salary was direct deposited into our joint account, and our monthly budget was tight enough that a $3,200 expense should have been noticeable, unless she had another source of income one didn't know about. I opened my laptop and began constructing a timeline, the same methodical approach I use for corporate investigations. I create a spreadsheet documenting every financial anomaly I'd noticed over the past year. The irregular direct deposits, the decreased 401k contributions, the unexplained transfers from savings, the consulting fees, the credit card charges to lifestyle consulting services. When I laid it all out chronologically, a pattern emerged. Sarah had been systematically repositioning our assets for months, possibly longer. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Jonathan Berkowitz, Sterling and Associates. I let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, he called again. This time I answered. Mr. Chun, a smooth voice said, Jonathan Berkowitz here. I represent your wife in your divorce proceedings. I was hoping we could schedule a preliminary discussion about asset division and settlement terms. His tone was perfectly professional, but there was an underlying assumption that I was just another soon-to-be ex-husband to be managed. I haven't retained counsel yet, I said. Surely we should wait until I have representation. Jonathan chuckled. Of course. But in my experience, these things go much smoother when both parties approach them reasonably. Your wife has indicated that you're a reasonable man, Mr. Chun. Perhaps we could meet informally, just to discuss the basic framework. I was curious about Jonathan Berkowitz, so I agreed to meet the following day. After hanging up, I dove deeper into researching Sterling and Associates. Their website was impressive, full of testimonials from grateful clients and case studies of complex asset divisions. But I noticed something interesting in the news archives. Sterling and Associates had represented clients in several high-profile cases over the past 2 years, including 3 divorces with a husband's later faced criminal charges for financial crimes. In each case, the pattern was similar. Successful businessman, seemingly stable marriage, then sudden divorce amid allegations of hidden assets or financial misconduct. The wives walked away with generous settlements just before federal investigations began. It could be coincidence, but I'd learned in my work that patterns were rarely accidental. I called David Kim, my mentor at Meridian Capital. David had been doing forensic financial analysis since before I was born, and he had contacts everywhere. David, I said when he answered, hypothetically, if someone wanted to investigate a law firm's client patterns and case outcomes, how would they go about it? David was quiet for a moment. Hypothetically, I'd start with public records. Divorce filings, criminal case databases, SEC enforcement actions. Everything leaves a paper trail, if you know where to look. Why? Just curious about some patterns I'm seeing. I said, nothing urgent. David chuckled. Marcus, in 30 years of doing this work, I've learned that when you say just curious, it usually means you're on to something big. If you need help, call me. I promised I would and hung up. That afternoon, I visited Sterling and Associates' offices in downtown Hartford. The building was exactly what you'd expect. Glass and steel, marble lobby, understated wealth everywhere. Jonathan Berkowitz met me in a conference room that overlooked the Connecticut River. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of confident smile that probably charmed clients and intimidated opponents in equal measure. Marcus, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming in. I know the situation is difficult, but I want you to know that Sarah and I are committed to making this as painless as possible. He gestured to a chair across from him. On the table were several file folders and a yellow legal pad covered with notes. I appreciate that, I said, settling into the leather chair. Though I'm curious why you wanted to meet before I have counsel. That seems unusual. Jonathan smiled. In my experience, emotions run high in these proceedings. Sometimes a calm conversation between reasonable people can prevent unnecessary escalation. Sarah speaks very highly of you, Marcus. She says you're analytical, logical, not prone to dramatic gestures. He opened one of the folders. I've reviewed your financial situation, and frankly, it's refreshingly straightforward. Joint checking and savings, retirement accounts, the house in Westfield. Nothing too complicated. He looked up at me. The goal here is to divide things equitably so both parties can move forward with their lives. What does Sarah consider equitable? I asked. Jonathan consulted his notes. She's proposed that she keep the house, given her emotional attachment to it and her desire for stability during this transition. You'd keep the majority of the retirement accounts, since they're largely funded by your contributions. The checking and savings would be split 50-50. I nodded thoughtfully. And what about debts? Credit card balances, any outstanding loans? Jonathan waved dismissively. Minimal. Sarah mentioned you've always been conservative with credit. That confirmed what I suspected. Jonathan's information came entirely from Sarah. He hadn't done independent verification of our financial situation. I see, I said. And the timeline Sarah's thinking? Ideally, we'd have everything resolved within 60 days, Jonathan replied. Quick, clean, minimally disruptive. Sarah's eager to start this new chapter of her life. I bet she was. Well, I stood up. I'll need time to review everything with my own attorney. Thank you for the information. Jonathan's smile tightened slightly. Of course. But Marcus, I should mention that the longer these things drag out, the more expensive they become for everyone involved. Sarah's prepared to be generous now, but financial positions can change. Was that a threat? Hard to tell with lawyers. They specialize in implications and subtext. That evening, I called James Morrison, a lawyer friend from college who specialized in corporate law rather than family law, but who I trusted to give me straight advice. James, I said, I need a referral to the best divorce attorney you know. Someone who specializes in complex financial cases. James was quiet for a moment. Marcus, is everything okay? I thought you and Sarah were solid. So did I said, but apparently I was wrong about a lot of things. James gave me 3 names, but one stood out. Patricia Reynolds at Reynolds & Associates. She's sharp as hell and doesn't intimidate easily, James said. If you've got complex finances or someone's trying to hide assets, she's your best bet. I called Patricia's office the next morning and managed to get an appointment for that afternoon. Her office was smaller than Sterling & Associates, but somehow more impressive. Where Jonathan's firm showed off with marble and gold fixtures, Patricia's office conveyed competence through walls lined with legal treatises and case files organized with military precision. Patricia herself was probably in her mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. Mr. Chun, she said, reviewing the documents I brought, tell me about your marriage. I gave her the basics. 10 years, no children, both professionals, seemingly stable until recently. And now your wife has retained Jonathan Berkowitz, Patricia said. Interesting choice. He's good at what he does, but he's expensive. How is she paying his retainer? I admitted I didn't know. His standard retainer is $50,000, Patricia said. Not impossible on your wife's salary, but it would require planning. She leaned back in her chair. Mr. Chun, in my experience, when someone hires Jonathan Berkowitz for what appears to be a straightforward divorce, there's usually more going on than meets the eye. He doesn't take simple cases. His firm specializes in high-conflict situations involving complex assets or unusual circumstances. What kind of unusual circumstances? I asked. Patricia smiled thinly. Sometimes people aren't who they appear to be. Sometimes assets aren't where they appear to be. Sometimes spouses know things about each other that create complications. She stood up and walked to her window. I'm going to need complete financial disclosure from you. Bank records, investment statements, tax returns for the past 5 years. Everything. Of course, I said. I've already started compiling that information. Patricia turned back to me. Good. But I also want you to prepare a different kind of documentation. A timeline of any unusual behavior or financial activities you've noticed over the past 2 years. Changes in routine, unexplained expenses, new relationships or activities. Think like the analyst you are. Over the next week, I threw myself into the most thorough investigation of my life. I created detailed timelines, cross-referenced financial records, and even used professional databases I had access to through Meridian Capital to research companies and individuals connected to Sarah. What I found was more extensive than I'd imagined. Sarah's company, Lux Brands, had several vendor relationships that seemed unusual. I found records of consulting contracts with companies that had no obvious connection to marketing or luxury goods. One company, Premium Lifestyle Solutions, had received over $200,000 in payments over the past year for strategic brand consulting. When I researched Premium Lifestyle Solutions, I found a company with no website, no employees listed on LinkedIn, and a registered address that led to a UPS store. But the real breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the signature on Sarah's company contracts with samples of her handwriting I had at home. The signatures didn't match. Someone else was signing contracts in Sarah's name, or Sarah was using an alternate signature I'd never seen. Either way, it suggested financial activities at her company that weren't what they appeared to be. I also discovered that Sarah's irregular direct deposits weren't random at all. They aligned perfectly with the dates when Premium Lifestyle Solutions received payments from Lux Brands. Sarah's salary increased by exactly the amount that her department paid to the consulting company. She wasn't just embezzling from her employer. She was doing it through a sophisticated system that made the payments look like legitimate business expenses. The consulting fees to Jennifer Walsh weren't just for divorce planning. According to the email record I could piece together, Jennifer had helped Sarah set up an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, supposedly for international investment opportunities. The account had been funded through transfers from Premium Lifestyle Solutions, effectively washing stolen money through multiple layers to make it untraceable. But the most damning discovery came when I found records showing that Premium Lifestyle Solutions shared a business address with Walsh Financial Strategies and two other consulting companies. All four companies had been incorporated within 6 months of each other, all used the same registered agent, and all had received payments from different divisions of Lux Brands. Sarah wasn't working alone. This was a network, a systematic operation designed to siphon money from corporate clients through inflated consulting fees and fake vendor relationships. And somehow, Jonathan Berkowitz's law firm was connected to it. 3 of the other shell companies had listed Sterling and Associates as their legal counsel during incorporation. I called Patricia Reynolds with my findings. "Mr. Chun," she said after I'd outlined what I discovered, "what you're describing isn't marriage fraud. It's a criminal enterprise." She paused. "And if Jonathan Berkowitz's firm is involved, that explains why your wife was so confident about the divorce proceedings. She probably thought you'd be too overwhelmed or intimidated to dig this deep. What's our next move?" I asked. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Normally, I'd advise we use this information as leverage for a favorable divorce settlement. But Mr. Chun, what you've uncovered involves multiple victims and potentially millions of dollars in fraud. This goes beyond divorce law. We need to involve federal authorities. That night, I sat in my study staring at the wall of evidence I'd assembled. Charts, timelines, financial records, corporate filings. Enough documentation to fill a dozen bankers' boxes. Sarah had been living a double life for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The woman I'd shared a bed with, planned a future with, trusted completely, was a criminal who'd been stealing money and planning to disappear with it. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Hope you're doing okay. I know this is hard. Maybe we can have coffee this weekend and talk things through like adults." I stared at the message for a long time. Even now, she was still playing the role of the concerned wife, trying to manage my emotions and control the narrative. I typed back, "I'm fine. Take whatever time you need." But I wasn't fine. I was angry, not at the divorce. I could understand growing apart, falling out of love, wanting different things. But the lies, the manipulation, the systematic theft, the betrayal not just of me but of her employer and ultimately other people's livelihoods, that was unforgivable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah thought she was divorcing a boring financial analyst who would quietly accept whatever settlement she offered. Instead, she'd picked a fight with someone whose job was exposing exactly the kind of fraud she'd been committing. She'd handed me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, thinking she held all the cards. But she'd underestimated the one person who could unravel her entire operation. 2 days later, I sat in a federal building in downtown Hartford, across from FBI Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez and IRS Criminal Investigation Agent Michael Torres. On the table between us were 3 boxes of documents I'd assembled and a laptop displaying the financial analysis I'd created. "Mr. Chun," Agent Rodriguez said, What you brought us appears to be evidence of sophisticated embezzlement and money laundering operation. But I have to ask, how did you come to possess all this information? I explained about the divorce, about Sarah's unusual behavior, about my background in forensic financial analysis. Agent Torres leaned forward. You're saying your wife has been embezzling funds from her employer through fake consulting companies, laundering the money through offshore accounts, and planning to use your divorce as cover to disappear with the proceeds? That's what the evidence suggests, I said. And I believe Sterling and Associates, her attorney's firm, may be involved. Several of the shell companies list them as legal counsel. The agents exchanged glances. Mr. Chun, Rodriguez said carefully, we've actually been investigating Sterling and Associates for several months in connection with a different matter. What you brought us could be the missing piece we've been looking for. She stood up. We're going to need you to continue operating normally. Don't confront your wife. Don't change your behavior. Let the divorce proceedings continue as planned. Can you do that? I nodded. Patricia had already briefed me on this possibility. Good, Torres said, because if this is as big as it appears, your cooperation could help us stop a lot more than just your wife's crimes. As I left the federal building, I realized that what started as a devastating personal betrayal was about to become something much larger. Sarah had thought she was divorcing an inconsequential middle manager. Instead, she triggered an investigation that would bring down an entire criminal network. That evening, Sarah called. Marcus, she said, her voice artificially cheerful. I was thinking we should probably sit down with our attorneys next week and start hammering out the details. Jonathan thinks we can have everything wrapped up by the end of the month, if we're both reasonable. That sounds good, I said, marveling at how calm my voice sounded. I'm sure we can work something out. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and began preparing for the most important meeting of my life, not with Sarah and her attorney, but with a room full of federal agents who were about to learn just how deep this conspiracy ran. Sarah thought she was weeks away from her new life, funded by stolen money and facilitated by corrupt lawyers. What she didn't know was that her entire operation was about to collapse, taking down some of the most powerful people in Connecticut's legal community with it. The quiet financial analyst she dismissed was about to become the star witness in the biggest white-collar crime investigation the state had seen in years. And it all started with divorce papers served at our anniversary dinner.